The photograph is labelled simply Market Square, Kazan, late 19th century. Stone arcades stretch outward, symmetrical, monumental. The street is empty, no carts, no merchants, no crowds. Yet, the census from the same decade lists Kazan as a thriving provincial capital, tens of thousands of inhabitants, dense trade, constant movement. The postcard image, printed for tourists, shows none of it. The architecture is finished, the city exists, the people do not. Under lamplight, the photograph's grain becomes visible, silver salts embedded in paper that has outlived its witnesses. A note scribbled on the reverse, barely legible, reads, "After restoration." What was restored? In a Paris archive, a much older document dated 1357 describes a territory called Tartaria, placed precisely where later maps insist nothing unified ever existed. Between the manuscript and the photograph lies a silence of centuries. Was history built gradually or reset? The Catalan Atlas of 1357 sits behind glass at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Created by the Mallorcan cartographer Abraham Cresques, it unfolds across 12 parchment leaves, each one dense with geographical detail. Modern historians describe it as medieval fantasy, a mixture of actual knowledge and legendary speculation. But the parchment tells a different story when examined closely. Across the eastern portion of the Eurasian landmass, one word appears repeatedly: Tartaria, not as a vague label for unknown lands, but as a defined region with internal divisions. The Great Khan's territories are marked separately. Persia is labelled distinctly. Tartaria occupies its own space, bordered deliberately, detailed carefully. Cities are named. Trade routes connect them. The cartographer has drawn architectural symbols suggesting permanent settlements, not nomadic camps. The official explanation is simple. Medieval Europeans used Tartaria as a catch-all term for the mysterious East, derived from Tatar and conflated with Tartarus, the classical underworld. By this logic, the atlas represents ignorance dressed as knowledge. But the parchment itself contradicts this comfortable narrative. The texture shows handling, not the pristine surface of decorative art, but the worn quality of working documents. Corrections appear in the margins, routes have been redrawn, city positions have been adjusted. This was not myth-making, this was administrative cartography. What is mapped with such precision is usually governed. What is corrected and revised is usually observed. The Catalan Atlas treats Tartaria not as legend, but as lived geography, a place where merchants travelled, cities functioned, and political boundaries mattered enough to record accurately. The question forms quietly: why would a functioning civilization, mapped with administrative care in 1357, vanish so completely from later historical records? By the 18th century, European cartography had achieved unprecedented accuracy. Expeditions measured coastlines, astronomers calculated longitude. The age of guesswork had supposedly ended. Yet during this same period of increasing precision, Tartaria began disappearing from maps. The transition is documented in comparative atlases. In 1738, Guillaume de Lisle's map of Asia still shows Tartary occupying vast territories. By 1804, John Carey's atlas contains no such label. The region has not fragmented into successor states. No new political entities have replaced the old designation. The land simply becomes anonymous, labeled by geographic features rather than civilizational names. Standard historical explanations emphasize progress. Earlier cartographers, lacking detailed knowledge, used placeholder terms. As exploration advanced, these vague labels gave way to accurate political geography. Tartaria disappeared because it never existed as a unified entity, merely a European misunderstanding. But the pattern of disappearance raises questions. Civilizations typically fragment. The Roman Empire became numerous kingdoms. The Mongol Empire splintered into khanates. Entities that once existed leave descendants, successors, inheritors. Their names evolve but persist in modified forms. Tartaria leaves nothing. No daughter states, no rival claimants, no regional identities preserving the old name. By 1850, the term exists only in antiquated maps, dismissed as medieval confusion. The absence feels deliberate rather than organic. When a label vanishes without successors, without fragments, without even local memory, the disappearance suggests something other than natural political evolution. It suggests erasure. What institution possessed both the motivation and capability to remove a civilizational label from collective geographic consciousness? The Kazan Kremlin rises above the Volga, a fortress of white stone walls and towers. Official histories credit its construction to Ivan the Terrible's builders following the conquest of 1552. The architecture is described as Russian Orthodox triumphalism, a deliberate replacement of previous Islamic structures. But the engineering tells a different story. The stone construction techniques exceed documented Russian capabilities of the mid-16th century. The walls incorporate structural principles including load distribution, foundation depth, and material composition, which appear in later Russian architecture only after Western European engineers were imported in the 17th century. There are no transitional buildings. There are no experimental structures showing the development of these techniques. The Kremlin simply appears, fully realized, employing methods that Russian builders had not yet learned. Construction records are curiously sparse. Documents describe renovations, repairs, and expansions, but the initial building phase remains undocumented. There are no labor requisitions, there are no timber purchase orders, there are no records of the massive workforce required for such construction. Photographs from the 19th century compound the mystery. The stonework shows weathering consistent with centuries of exposure, not the relatively fresh appearance expected from structures barely 300 years old. Lichen growth patterns, mortar degradation, and stone surface erosion all suggest greater age than official chronology allows. The comfortable explanation invokes lost records, incomplete documentation, and the chaos of 16th century warfare. Perhaps the construction documents burned, perhaps the techniques were imported but not recorded, perhaps the weathering accelerated due to local climate. But stone remembers what paper forgets. The walls stand as physical evidence of capabilities that should not exist in their attributed time period. The Kremlin's existence poses a simple question. Who built structures requiring technology and resources not yet available to their supposed builders? The postcard collections from late 19th century Russia contain thousands of images. St. Petersburg's grand boulevards, Moscow's merchant districts, Samarkand's market squares. City after city, monument after monument, street after street, and in image after image, the same peculiar absence, people. The standard explanation is photographic limitation. Early camera technology required long exposure times. Moving subjects created blur, so photographers waited for empty moments. This explanation appears in every textbook, every museum caption, every archival description. But exposure times cannot fully account for the pattern. By the 1880s, instantaneous photography existed. Cameras could freeze motion, capture crowds, preserve the bustle of urban life. Yet the empty street aesthetic persisted in postcards marketed specifically to show thriving cities. More troubling, the absence is not limited to people. Carts should leave traces even if moving. Horses should appear as blurred shapes. Market stalls should be visible even without vendors. Yet the photographs show completed urban infrastructure in pristine isolation, architecture without activity, cities without inhabitants. A postcard from the 1890s St. Petersburg shows Nevsky Prospect. The avenue stretches toward the horizon, lined with elaborate buildings. The pavement is visible, clean, unmarked. No carriages, no pedestrians, no dogs, no birds, nothing living appears in the frame. The back of the postcard reads, Prospect, Principal, St. Petersburg. Principal prospect of a major imperial capital, depicted as if awaiting its first residents. In isolation, each photograph might have a mundane explanation. Perhaps the photographer chose early morning. Perhaps the weather kept people indoors. Perhaps this particular moment captured an unusual lull. But the pattern repeats across hundreds of images, dozens of cities, multiple continents. The photographs whisper a disturbing possibility. What if the cities were finished before the people arrived? The Russian Empire census of 1897 represents a landmark in demographic history, the first comprehensive population count across all imperial territories. The results showed approximately 125 million inhabitants distributed across vast geographic regions. But earlier demographic data reveals peculiar patterns. Regional populations appear to double, sometimes triple, within single generations, growth rates that exceed biological possibility, even accounting for high birth rates. In Siberian territories, census estimates from the 1850s show sparse settlement. By the 1890s, cities like Tomsk and Irkutsk report populations in the tens of thousands. Official explanations cite migration, penal colonization, and railway construction bringing workers. Yet corresponding immigration records do not exist. No manifest documenting massive population transfers, no army records showing sufficient penal colonists, no railway company employment logs accounting for workers who supposedly remained after construction ended. Parish birth records compound the mystery. In rapidly growing towns, baptism registers should show population increase through natural growth, families expanding, children being born into established communities. Instead, many registries show something else. Sudden appearance of adults, complete families materializing in census records with no prior local presence. A notation in Kazan's municipal records dated 1869 remarks on new inhabitants registered following administrative reorganization. The phrasing is bureaucratic and unremarkable. But what reorganization places thousands of people into a city's population count without documenting their origin? The demographic mathematics creates an impossibility. Birth rates, even at historical maximums, cannot explain the population surges. Migration, even accounting for undocumented movement, cannot fill the numerical gaps. The people appear faster than families can produce them. Two explanations remain. Either the earlier census estimates were catastrophically inaccurate, underestimating populations by factors of 2 or 3, or populations were placed rather than grown, appearing in records through administrative action rather than biological reproduction. The census data transforms from simple statistics into evidence of a demographic discontinuity whose cause remains officially unexplained. The Foundling Hospital of Moscow maintained meticulous intake records throughout the 19th century. Each entry documented the child's approximate age, physical condition, and any identifying information. A typical entry might read, "Male child, approximately 3 years, healthy, brought by parish priest from Tula region," but thousands of entries contain a different notation. Origin unknown, no accompanying adult, no identifying documents. The scale is unprecedented. Between 1850 and 1880, Moscow's foundling system processed over 50,000 children whose origins could not be determined. Not orphans whose parents had died, but orphans who simply appeared, sometimes in groups, sometimes individually, without any documentation of prior existence. Similar patterns appear across Europe. Paris foundling hospitals recorded the same phenomenon. London's orphan asylums noted unusual influx periods when dozens of children arrived within days, all lacking documentation, all described as found wandering or delivered by unknown parties. The standard explanation invokes poverty, social upheaval, rural desperation. Parents unable to care for children abandoned them to institutions. Epidemics created orphans. Economic collapse forced families to surrender children they could not feed. But epidemics leave records, burial registries, death certificates, parish documentation of catastrophe. Economic collapses appear in financial archives, tax records, bankruptcy proceedings. The orphan waves come without corresponding disaster documentation. More puzzling, the children themselves, many arrived in reasonable health, clothed adequately, showing no signs of prolonged neglect. They appeared not as victims of catastrophe, but as products of some organized system of distribution. A notation from the Paris Hospice des Enfants Trouvé, dated 1862, observes, "The children arrive regularly, every third Tuesday, quantities varying from 12 to 20. They appear accustomed to institutional routine, not traumatized by abandonment, but adapted to systematic care. Not orphans fleeing disaster, but children transferred between institutions." The question forms, what system created such regular flows of undocumented children, and where were they before they arrived? The World's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago in 1893, commemorating 4 centuries since Columbus's arrival in the Americas. Official records describe it as a temporary exhibition, grand buildings constructed specifically for the fair, intended for demolition after closing. The scale was staggering. More than 200 buildings covering more than 600 acres. Elaborate neoclassical structures, massive domes, columned facades, sculptural ornamentation. The official narrative claims these White City buildings were made of staff, a mixture of plaster and fiber, providing the appearance of marble while allowing temporary construction. But photographs reveal troubling details. The buildings display engineering sophistication inconsistent with temporary structures. Electrical infrastructure, plumbing systems, ventilation networks, all integrated into the architecture with a permanence suggesting intended longevity. Timelines compound the mystery. The fair opened in 1893. Groundbreaking occurred in 1891. 2 years to design, engineer, and construct hundreds of elaborate buildings, a pace that strains credibility even with temporary materials. More curious, the exhibitions themselves. One of the most popular displays was the Incubator Baby exhibit, where premature infants were cared for in a public demonstration of mass infant care technology. Thousands of visitors paid to observe systematized child rearing, temperature-controlled environments, scheduled feeding, clinical monitoring. The exhibit presented this as innovation, medical progress, humanitarian advancement, but it also normalized something else, the idea that children could be raised institutionally, without families, in controlled environments designed for efficiency rather than intimacy. After the fair closed, the buildings were demolished. Official accounts emphasize this as planned, temporary structures removed to restore the landscape. But photographs from the demolition show structural elements inconsistent with staff construction, load-bearing walls of substance, foundations suggesting permanence. The World's Fair transforms from exhibition to hypothesis. What if these were not showcases of future technology, but demonstrations of existing infrastructure? What if the fairs were not introducing systems, but reintroducing populations to capabilities they would soon encounter? What if the spectacle was orientation, not innovation? A peculiar synchronicity appears when comparing architectural photographs across continents. The same neoclassical proportions emerge simultaneously in Paris, St. Petersburg, Buenos Aires, Melbourne. Not similar styles evolving independently, but identical design principles manifesting worldwide within decades. Official history attributes this to cultural exchange, European imperial influence, and shared architectural education. French architects trained Russians who influenced Argentinians who inspired Australians. Style spread through networks of knowledge, travel, and colonial administration. But the timing is too precise. The same building types, grand boulevards, domed administrative buildings, and symmetrical public squares appear across continents without sufficient time for gradual diffusion. The architecture manifests not as evolving style, but as an implemented standard. More striking are the construction techniques. The buildings employ identical structural principles regardless of location. Same load-bearing systems, same dome construction methods, same stone cutting approaches. Regional materials differ, but engineering remains constant. In traditional architectural evolution, regional variations emerge. Local materials influence design. Climate demands adaptation. Cultural preferences modify form. Yet the global neoclassical implementation shows minimal regional variation, suggesting not organic evolution but deliberate standardization. The hypothesis forms: what if this architecture was not spreading but pre-existing? What if these buildings represent not construction but restoration, renovation, or repurposing of inherited infrastructure? Photographs support the possibility. Many 19th century images show new buildings with weathering inconsistent with recent construction. Stone surfaces display erosion patterns requiring centuries. Mortar shows degradation suggesting greater age than official chronology allows. The construction records themselves raise questions. Projects described as taking years sometimes appear completed in months. Labor forces documented as hundreds somehow accomplish work requiring thousands. The mathematics of construction, materials required, workers needed, and time elapsed, frequently fails to balance. A pattern emerges, completed cities appearing faster than construction allows, displaying architectural unity, suggesting central planning, employing techniques spreading too rapidly for organic diffusion, and showing weathering inconsistent with attributed ages. The architecture whispers an alternative timeline, not gradual building across centuries, but rapid renovation of existing infrastructure by populations who inherited rather than created their built environment. The temporal problem becomes acute when construction dates are examined systematically. The late 19th century shows an explosion of monumental architecture across the globe: cathedrals, government buildings, railway stations, opera houses, and museums. Each project required years of planning, skilled labor, and massive material resources. St. Isaac's Cathedral in St. Petersburg officially took 40 years to complete, from 1818 to 1858, employing thousands of workers. The Paris Opera required 14 years, from 1861 to 1875. The Hungarian Parliament building needed 17 years, from 1885 to 1902. These timelines are documented, verified, reasonable. But when all projects are mapped temporally and geographically, an impossibility emerges. Too many megastructures completed simultaneously across too wide a geographic range. The skilled labor required, stonemasons, engineers, craftsmen capable of working at monumental scale, would exceed available populations. In the 1880s alone, major cathedral projects were underway in Budapest, Vienna, Moscow, Barcelona, and Montreal. Simultaneously, government buildings rose in Berlin, Buenos Aires, and Melbourne. Opera houses appeared in Paris, Prague, and Sydney. The cumulative labor requirements would demand hundreds of thousands of specialized workers, a workforce that does not appear in immigration records, guild registrations, or training institution archives. The standard explanation invokes industrialization, improved tools, and efficiency gains. Steam power and mechanization allowed fewer workers to accomplish more. Railways facilitated material transport and standardized components reduced custom work. But mechanization cannot fully account for the acceleration. Skilled stonework remains hand labor. Decorative elements require artisan expertise. Structural engineering demands experienced judgment. The core work of monumental architecture resists automation. An alternative interpretation emerges from the temporal clustering. What if the dates represent not construction, but administrative assignment? What if 19th century completion meant restoration, renovation, or repurposing of existing structures rather than creation from foundation? This hypothesis explains the impossible timelines, the mysteriously adequate labor forces, the global synchronicity. The buildings existed, populations arrived, dates were assigned, marking not construction, but occupancy, not creation, but inheritance. Time itself becomes suspect. The official chronology strains under the weight of its own requirements. The alternative, inherited infrastructure reassigned to populations who did not build it, explains what construction timelines cannot. The orphan train movement in the United States, operating from 1854 to 1929, officially transported over 200,000 children from eastern cities to western rural communities. The stated purpose was humanitarian, rescuing urban orphans from poverty and providing them opportunities in agricultural regions. But the system's organization suggests something beyond charity. The Children's Aid Society and similar organizations operated with remarkable efficiency, regular schedules, predetermined destinations, and systematic placement procedures. Children were bathed, dressed uniformly, and transported in organized groups to towns where families had been pre-selected to receive them. The receiving communities were themselves curious. Many were recently established settlements, towns appearing in census records with suspicious rapidity. The demographic pattern mirrors the one observed in Russian territories, sparse settlement followed by sudden population presence, with orphan arrivals coinciding with municipal organization. A notation from an 1875 placement record in Nebraska describes the process. 23 children delivered to Kearney, families assigned by regional administrator. Integration proceeded smoothly. The language is bureaucratic and systematic. Not charity, but distribution. Not rescue, but assignment. The children themselves were described in ways that echo European foundling hospital records. Many were healthy and adequately educated, showing no signs of prolonged deprivation. They arrived not as casualties of urban poverty, but as prepared populations ready for placement. Photographs from orphan train distributions show orderly scenes, children lined up for inspection, families making selections, officials documenting placements. The visual record resembles administrative processing more than humanitarian rescue. The hypothesis crystallizes. What if the orphan trains were not rescuing abandoned children, but distributing prepared populations? What if the western towns were not growing organically, but being populated deliberately? What if the system represented not charity, but resettlement? Viewed in isolation, these were adoption programs. Observed systematically across decades and continents, they become resettlement infrastructure. The orphan waves, the empty cities, the synchronized architecture, the impossible construction timelines, all elements of a single pattern. The pattern suggests populations appearing where census records show growth, infrastructure existing before populations arrive, administrative systems distributing people rather than documenting organic movement. A world not built gradually, but reassembled deliberately. Genealogical research reveals a peculiar limitation. Millions of family trees terminate abruptly in the early to mid-19th century, not gradually fading into undocumented rural poverty, but stopping cleanly at a temporal boundary. Parish records, the foundation of European genealogy, show a curious pattern. Baptism registers from the 1860s onward are detailed, complete, meticulously maintained. Earlier records are sparse, inconsistent, and frequently missing. The explanation given is administrative improvement. Earlier record-keeping was haphazard, later systems more rigorous. But the discontinuity is too sharp. Records do not gradually improve, they suddenly begin. Churches that supposedly existed for centuries have registries starting in the 1850s or the 1860s with no explanation for earlier absence. More troubling are the entries themselves. Many baptisms in the 1860s to the 1880s involve adults or older children, not infants. The records describe regularization of status and formal registration following administrative reform. The language suggests documentation of existing people, not recording of new births. Immigration records compound the mystery. Families appear in census data claiming multi-generational presence in regions where no prior documentation of their lineage exists. The grandfather supposedly born in this village has no baptism record. The grandmother's parents are unnamed in marriage documents. The family tree begins with assertion rather than documentation. For millions, ancestry research reaches this barrier and stops. Before the mid-19th century, documentation vanishes. The genealogical record treats the 19th century as a beginning point, not because earlier people did not exist, but because their existence left no paper trail. The official explanation invokes incomplete archives, lost records, and the difficulties of researching pre-industrial populations. But lost records leave traces, damaged registries, fire documentation, and administrative notes about missing volumes. The genealogical barrier shows clean absence, not damaged preservation. The implication unsettles. What if lineages do not extend further back because they do not exist further back? What if populations appearing in mid-19th century records represent not continued lines but starting points? What if the genealogical barrier marks not incomplete documentation but actual discontinuity? Identity depends on continuity. Legitimacy requires ancestry. The genealogical barrier threatens both by suggesting our pasts may be shorter than we believe. Educational reforms in the mid to late 19th century transformed how history was taught. Textbooks were standardized, curricula centralized, and examination systems implemented. Official narratives emphasize this as progress, replacing local variation with universal education and folk knowledge with scientific understanding. But the reforms also accomplished something else. They compressed time. Complex regional histories were simplified into national narratives. Ambiguous periods were clarified with definitive dates. Competing interpretations were resolved into singular accounts. The past became cleaner, shorter, and more manageable. Comparative analysis of textbooks shows the transformation. Educational materials from the 1850s present European history as complicated, contested, full of regional variation and chronological uncertainty. By the 1890s, the same history appears streamlined, definitive, and organized into clear periods with established dates. The compression is most visible in pre-modern history. Medieval periods that earlier texts describe as lengthy and complex become shortened in later materials. Ancient chronologies that previous generations debated are presented as settled fact. The distant past contracts, becoming more remote and less detailed. Map revisions mirror the textbook changes. Terms like Tartaria disappear from school atlases. Complex political geographies are simplified. The past becomes easier to understand by becoming less detailed, less complicated, less contradictory. The official explanation is pedagogical efficiency. Simplified narratives help students learn. Standardization ensures consistent education. Reducing complexity makes history accessible. But something is also lost: the memory of alternatives. Once students learn the simplified version, the complicated reality becomes difficult to access. The textbooks do not just teach history, they replace previous understanding with an authorized narrative. Institutional amnesia operates this way, not through destroying records, but through replacing them with newer, cleaner versions. The old maps still exist in archives, but students learn from new ones. The old textbooks remain in rare collections, but classrooms use updated editions. The past is gradually overwritten by an authorized present. Who benefits from a shortened, simplified past? Institutions requiring legitimacy. Governments claiming ancient continuity. Systems presenting themselves as inevitable rather than contingent. The educational reforms accomplish more than teaching history. They establish what history is, what can be questioned, what must be accepted. Forgetting, it turns out, can be engineered through standardization. The photograph remains on the table. Market Square, Kazan, late 19th century. Stone arcades stretching into emptiness. Architecture complete, population absent. What once appeared as photographic limitation now suggests something else. The empty streets were not accidents of exposure time, but accurate documentation. The cities were finished, waiting. The infrastructure existed before the inhabitants arrived. The pattern assembles from accumulated evidence. Medieval maps show civilizations that later cartography erases. Cathedrals appear too quickly, built with techniques unavailable to their supposed builders. Photographs document completed cities without populations. Census records show demographic impossibilities. Foundling hospitals process thousands of children without origins. World S fairs display systematized child-rearing to populations about to encounter exactly such systems. Synchronized global architecture suggests inherited standards rather than evolved styles. Construction timelines require impossible labor forces. Orphan trains distribute prepared children to pre-established communities. Genealogies terminate cleanly at arbitrary dates. Educational reforms compress and simplify historical narratives. Each element, isolated, permits conventional explanation. Combined, they form a pattern that conventional history struggles to address. What if the world we inherited was not built by recent generations but received from a predecessor civilization? What if the 19th century represents not industrial creation but systematic repopulation of existing infrastructure? What if Tartaria was not erased because it was mythical, but because its existence contradicted the narrative of gradual progress? The hypothesis remains speculative. Archival evidence permits multiple interpretations, but the pattern persists. Infrastructure appearing before populations, populations appearing without origins, timelines compressing impossibly, records beginning abruptly, ancestors vanishing beyond arbitrary dates. If this alternative interpretation approaches accuracy, the implications ripple outward. We are not descendants of those who built our cities, but inheritors assigned to occupy them. Our genealogies trace not to ancient lineages, but to 19th century starting points. Our institutions claim continuity they may not possess. Our past may be shorter, stranger, and more deliberately constructed than official narratives suggest. The photograph offers no resolution, only presence. The empty square waits. The question persists: were we born into this world or assigned to it? The answer remains in archives, in photographs, in gaps where documentation should exist but does not, in patterns that whisper alternatives to everything we have been taught. Perhaps civilization did not rise, perhaps it resumed,